Hello everyone. In this really short video, we're going to look at the difference between a binding and a non-binding constraint, or really how we can identify a binding and a non-binding constraint. When we find our optimal solution, which we have done in this example, and notice this is example 2 here dealing with the garden shop, we found that the optimal solution was located at the intersection point between constraint 2 and constraint 3. Any of the constraints that deal with the intersection point at the optimal solution will always be binding constraints. So in this question, constraint 2 and constraint 3 are binding. Constraint 1, which is not at the intersection point of the optimal solution, will be a non-binding constraint. The reason why we refer to them as binding and non-binding is because if we were to alter the values at all of constraint 2 and constraint 3, if we are to alter anything to do with those constraints, we will be changing our optimal solution. Constraint 1 is not currently impacting the optimal solution, so we have a certain degree of play that we have with constraint 1. But what we have to do here is simply be able to identify which constraints are binding and which constraints are non-binding. And again, any constraint at the optimal solution intersection point will be binding. So constraint 2, constraint 3 intersect at the optimal solution point. Those are binding constraints. In this example, constraint 1 is not involved in that optimal solution point, so it is a non-binding constraint. Whereas in example 1, dealing with the farmer planting his 8 acres of land, our optimal solution point occurred at the intersection point of constraint 1 and constraint 2. So both constraint 1 and constraint 2 would be considered binding constraints in this example. But remember, the optimal solution point didn't have to be here. Depending on the way the slope of our objective function worked out, we may have had this point as our optimal solution, in which case only constraint 1 would have been binding, and constraint 2 would not have been involved at this point, so it would be non-binding. Or if the slope was a very steep slope, we may have had, or a steep negative slope, we may have had our optimal solution occur here, in which case constraint 2 would be the only constraint involved at that optimal solution point. And constraint 2 would have been binding and constraint 1 non-binding. So again, quick recap, any constraint involved at the optimal solution intersection point will always be a binding constraint. Any constraint that is not involved at the optimal solution intersection point will be a non-binding constraint. Please pay attention for our next video where we're going to discuss slack and surplus and how we would calculate the amount of slack and surplus associated with certain constraints. Thank you. As always, please email me with any questions that you have.